Picture a tank that doesn't roar, doesn't dominate the horizon, doesn't even look like the armored monsters the US has relied on for 40 years. Instead, imagine a machine that moves like a whisper across the battlefield. A 40-ton ghost built to outthink enemies instead of outmuscling them. That was the XM1202. Born inside the Army's most ambitious modernization push, this strange, almost futuristic tank broke every rule of armor design. No thick steel walls, no four-man crew, no lumbering silhouette. It was quiet, it was light, and its entire survival plan depended on staying invisible until the moment it fired. Commanders called it bold, Congress called it risky, engineers called it the future. And then, without ever rolling onto a real battlefield, the Army shut it down. So why kill a tank that promised speed, precision, and a kind of digital lethality the Abrams could only dream about? That's the story we're breaking open. Because once you see what the XM1202 was trying to do, you'll understand why some people still think canceling it was a mistake. When the Army launched Future Combat Systems, it wasn't chasing an upgrade, it was chasing reinvention. The goal sounded almost reckless: replace the heaviest, most battle-proven armor in American history with a family of lightweight, networked, sensor-driven vehicles that could move faster, deploy quicker, and strike farther than anything on the field. The Abrams was unbeatable in a head-on fight, but it came with a brutal price. It was massive, it guzzled fuel, and getting an armored brigade overseas required a logistical ballet that 8 days. So the Army did something unheard of. It set strict weight caps, real caps, numbers that forced engineers to strip away decades of comfort and start from zero. All 8 manned ground vehicles had to share a common chassis. They had to fit inside strategic airlifters without disassembly, and they had to survive threats not through slabs of armor, but through awareness, precision, and digital coordination. It was bold. It was futuristic. It was the kind of ambition that only exists when a military believes it's designing for a conflict 20 years ahead. And somewhere inside that constellation of ideas sat the XM1202, the one vehicle expected to replace the tank that saved American lives in Iraq and rolled through Kuwait with unstoppable momentum. Replacing the Abrams wasn't just another requirement. It was a dare. And the XM1202 took that dare head-on. But chasing a revolution always comes with a price. And the closer we get to the XM1202 itself, the more those risks start to show. The XM1202 didn't look like an Abrams. That wasn't an accident. It couldn't afford to. With the weight ceiling locked, every inch of the vehicle had to earn its place. So engineers built a tank around a single question. How do you deliver Abrams-level punch without Abrams-level mass? The answer started with the XM360, a lightweight 120mm cannon capable of firing high-pressure kinetic rounds that hit harder than its weight class suggested. Tests showed it could match, and in some cases exceed, the lethality of the Abrams M256 gun. Pair that with planned guided ammunition that could chase and kill targets beyond the crew's direct line of sight, and the XM1202 suddenly looked dangerous, even without brute force. Then came the crew layout. Just 2 soldiers, 1 driver, 1 gunner commander. Everything else was automated: ammo handling, target recognition, turret operations, screens replaced periscopes, sensors replaced eyeballs. Turret workload dropped into something closer to managing a system rather than wrestling a war machine. But the most radical shift sat inside its armor philosophy. Instead of stacking steel until enemies gave up shooting, the XM1202 aimed for something smarter. Lighter composite armor, lower profile, active protection catching or spoofing incoming threats. Reduced signatures in multiple spectrums so the tank was hard to track, hard to paint, and much harder to hit. It wasn't a beast built to endure punishment. It was a predator designed to avoid it. But a tank isn't judged in a vacuum. It lives or dies in the way it fights. And the XM1202 wasn't built to fight alone. To understand the XM1202, you have to forget everything the Abrams taught us about tank warfare. The Abrams wins by smashing through the front door. The XM1202 wins by slipping through the side window before anyone notices. And that difference only makes sense once you understand the battlefield it was designed for. Future Combat Systems imagined a brigade where every asset talked to the others. UAVs scanned ahead. Ground sensors detected movement. Recon vehicles confirmed targets. All of that data flowed into the network and straight into the XM1202's displays. The tank didn't need to see the enemy with naked eyes. It only needed the system to tell it where to aim. In that ideal fight, XM1202 crews fired from defilade positions, hitting armored threats miles away with guided shells. No line-of-sight duels, no exposed silhouettes, just stealth, speed, and precision stacked into a single rhythm. It was tank combat reimagined as a coordinated digital ambush. This wasn't theoretical fantasy either. Early tests of FCS sensors and data sharing showed real promise. For the first time, tankers could have struck targets outside traditional engagement envelopes, relying on an ecosystem of eyes feeding them information. But that dependency came with a dark edge. The XM1202 wasn't built to stand alone. Its power only existed as long as the network stayed alive, because everything looked incredible in simulations. Then reality stepped in. If you're enjoying this breakdown, hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel go deeper into military tech that almost changed history. While engineers were sketching digital battlefields on glowing screens, the real war the Army was fighting looked nothing like those predictions. Iraq and Afghanistan were teaching a harsher, messier lesson. The deadliest threat wasn't heavy armor rolling across plains. It was improvised explosives tearing through vehicles on crowded streets. It was RPG teams ambushing convoys inside narrow alleys. It was chaos, dust, and uncertainty. And suddenly, the XM1202's lightweight dream started to look fragile. Analysts warned that even with advanced armor composites and active defenses, a vehicle that light simply couldn't absorb the kind of punishment insurgents were inflicting daily. Blast profiles from IEDs were rising. Even the Abrams, with its thick layers of armor and massive weight, was taking damage. So when commanders imagined a 40-ton replacement, the reaction wasn't excitement. It was unease. Then came the networking issue. The XM1202's entire survival model depended on clean communication links, uninterrupted data flow, and an enemy incapable of jamming, spoofing, or degrading signals. But real combat has a way of shredding perfect plans. Radios get jammed. Towers get hit. Satellites lose windows. And when that happens, a tank built around digital awareness becomes a target waiting to be found. The gap between the theory and the battlefield widened fast. And in Washington, patience thinned even faster. And this is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because the XM1202 didn't fail. Something else took it down. Inside the Pentagon, the concerns around XM1202 weren't whispered anymore. They were printed on briefings stacked in front of lawmakers. Costs were ballooning. The network it depended on was behind schedule. And FCS had become the most expensive modernization project the Army had ever attempted. Then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates stepped in with a blunt message. Ambition wasn't enough. Not when soldiers were dying from IEDs, while the Army poured billions into vehicles that seemed too light for the threats outside every FOB gate. Congress saw the same problem. The XM1202 didn't have a survivability issue on paper. It had one in perception. If a future tank couldn't promise visible, proven protection, no one wanted to sign their name under it. And by 2009, few believed a 40-ton replacement for the Abrams could ever survive the politics of wartime decision-making. So the axe came down. Not on the gun, not on the automation, not on the design, but on the entire manned ground vehicles family. XM1202 died in the same stroke. But the strangest part of the story is that the XM1202 most people saw wasn't even the XM1202 the Army planned to build. Here's the twist. The XM1202 wasn't a finished prototype like the X-32 or the Comanche helicopter. It was a near tank on paper, supported by real subsystems, real gun tests, and real automation demos. But the full vehicle never rolled out in steel. What did exist was a turret concept, a cannon that passed pressure tests, crew stations that functioned, and an automated loading system that showed promise. The chassis? Shared across all MGV platforms. But no unified XM1202 hull was ever completed before cancellation. The vehicle that appears in concept art with that low, almost predatory profile was the production version the Army assumed would eventually take shape once integration was finished. This isn't unusual in massive programs. The Apache didn't start as the Apache we know, neither did the Abrams. But canceling FCS meant XM1202 never got its second stage, the part where engineers fix flaws, refine the shape, adjust armor angles, and turn theory into a machine that breathes. And that's where the what-ifs begin. What would a full XM1202 have looked like? How different would its protection, sensors, and mobility have been when real testing forced changes? Because even though the XM1202 never became a real tank, pieces of it definitely survived. When FCS went down, the Army didn't bury everything with it. Some parts of XM1202 quietly escaped. The XM360 gun program continued longer than expected, feeding data into future cannon studies. Engineers proved you could build a 120mm weapon with significantly less recoil and weight without sacrificing firepower. That mattered a lot. Then there's automation. The Army's push toward reduced crew size didn't vanish. You'll see echoes of XM1202 thinking inside modern optional manned fighting vehicle concepts, robotic wingmen initiatives, and prototype turrets that handle ammunition without human loaders. Even the sensor fusion ideas, the ones originally tied to FCS networking, resurfaced inside programs that demanded better targeting in cluttered environments. And while no current US tank is lightweight enough to mirror the XM1202's vision, the signature reduction work didn't disappear either. Modern armor programs talk about thermal masking, acoustic dampening, and visual deception in ways the early 2000s Army would have considered ambitious. So the XM1202 didn't simply vanish. It broke apart and dissolved into design cultures, prototypes, and R&D projects across 2 decades. Its full body died, but its bones still shape the future. But now comes the harder question, one the Army still hasn't truly answered. To judge the XM1202 fairly, you have to split the verdict in two. Technically, it was brilliant. A lightweight tank that hit harder than its size suggested. A crew layout that cut manpower without cutting lethality. A gun that showed real promise in testing. And a battlefield concept that leaned on precision and knowledge instead of armor thickness. But strategically, the timing was brutal. The Army was fighting a war defined by roadside bombs, not armored divisions. Commanders trusted weight because weight kept people alive. Network-reliant vehicles felt fragile, and no matter how clean the simulations looked, no one wanted a tank that needed perfect communications to survive. Did the Army kill the XM1202 because it was flawed? Not exactly. It killed it because it demanded a future the Army wasn't ready to gamble on. Yet here's the irony. Modern battlefields filled with drones, precision strikes, and AI-assisted targeting look a lot like the environment XM1202 was designed for. The war it needed simply hadn't arrived yet. And that's why the XM1202 remains one of the most haunting, almost weapons in US military history. The XM1202 never fired a shot, yet its shadow still hangs over every debate about the future of armored warfare. It wasn't a failure. It was a warning that sometimes technology moves faster than trust. If you want more deep dives into weapons that almost reshaped history, hit subscribe and stick around. There's always another story hiding behind a canceled project.